Have you ever prayed so long for something that you started to wonder if God even heard you? You keep showing up, saying the same words, hoping this time the silence breaks, but all you get is, nothing. That's where this story begins. There was a man, ordinary guy, maybe a lot like you or me. Mid-40s, steady job, family, decent life. From the outside, everything looked fine. But inside, he carried a quiet restlessness, that feeling that there must be more to life than just routines, bills, and small victories. Every morning before work, he'd sit by his window with a cup of coffee, stare out at the sunrise, and whisper the same prayer. God, show me what to do. Give me direction. He prayed that prayer every single day. For years. Through job changes. Through marriage highs and lows. Through seasons of joy and frustration. Years passed, and still, nothing seemed to change. Sometimes he'd joke with friends about how he was still waiting on God's signal. Other times, in private, he wasn't laughing. He'd sit there, staring at the same sky, whispering the same question. Why won't you say something? He wasn't angry, just confused. Because he believed. He really did. He had seen God move in other people's lives. He'd heard stories of people getting signs, dreams, breakthroughs. But for him? Silence. One evening, after another long day at work, he came home, kicked off his shoes, and dropped onto the couch. He stared at the ceiling inside. God, I'm tired of not hearing you. I've been asking for 20 years. What am I doing wrong? And that night, for the first time in 2 decades, he didn't rush his prayer. He didn't list requests. He just sat there. Quiet. Minutes passed. Then, in that stillness, something unexpected stirred in his heart. A thought, gentle, but clear, rose up inside him. Why do you keep asking, when I've been answering all along? He froze. It wasn't an audible voice, but it was unmistakable. The kind of inner knowing that feels bigger than your own thoughts. He whispered, but I never heard you speak. And again, that quiet impression came, steady, patient, loving. You never stopped talking long enough to listen. The room felt heavier somehow, but not in a bad way, more like the weight of realization. He sat there, remembering all those years of words, requests, noise. All the times he had prayed and immediately moved on. All the mornings he spoke to God but never paused to speak with him. It hit him. Maybe the silence wasn't God's absence, maybe it was his own. He thought back on moments he had ignored. That conversation with a stranger that nudged him toward forgiveness. That sudden peace he'd felt during a storm. That gut feeling not to take a certain job, which he later found out would have been a disaster. Could those have been answers? He began to replay years of memories in a new light. Maybe God had been speaking, through people, through moments, through whispers he had brushed off because they didn't sound dramatic or supernatural. Tears filled his eyes. Not from sadness, but from relief. All this time, he wasn't unheard, he was simply too loud to hear. The next morning, he did something different. He woke up before the sunrise, made his coffee, and sat by the same window. But this time, he didn't start talking. He just sat. Watched. Breathed. At first, it felt awkward, like waiting on a phone call that might never come. His mind wandered. He thought about errands, bills, deadlines. Then, gradually, something shifted. His breathing slowed. His thoughts quieted. And in that quiet, he felt it again, that gentle peace. Not a voice. Not words. Just presence. He smiled. Okay, he whispered softly, I think I understand now. From that day on, his prayers changed. He still talked to God, but he left space, pauses, moments of listening. Sometimes he wrote down what he sensed. Sometimes he just sat in gratitude. And strangely, decisions started getting clearer. Not because heaven opened with thunder or a booming voice, but because he was finally quiet enough to notice the subtle ways God had been guiding him all along. He began seeing patterns, like how certain opportunities came when he felt peace, and confusion always followed when he ignored it. He realized that God's direction wasn't hidden, it had been woven into everyday life. He'd hear a line in a song that spoke straight to what he prayed about the night before. A friend would share something that answered a question he hadn't told anyone. Or he'd open his journal and notice how God had been slowly steering him toward growth, not just guidance. And the more he listened, the more he recognized God's fingerprints in everything, even the waiting. There's something beautiful about that transformation. Because it's not just about one man, it's about all of us. How many of us are still praying the same prayer, over and over, wondering why heaven's silent, when maybe the real silence is on our side? We live in a world of constant noise. Notifications. Podcasts. Messages. Voices everywhere. Even our prayers can become part of the noise, a long list of requests we rush through before moving on with our day. But relationships don't grow in noise. They grow in connection. The man in this story didn't discover a new way to pray, he rediscovered what prayer was always meant to be, a two-way conversation, not a one-way performance. He learned that sometimes God's silence isn't rejection, it's invitation. An invitation to slow down, breathe, and make room for a response. Because sometimes God speaks softly, not to make it hard to hear, but to draw us closer, to teach us that his voice is best heard in stillness. That moment changed him. He didn't become some mystical guru. He still had questions, bills, bad days. But he carried something different, a quiet confidence that he wasn't walking alone. Prayer no longer felt like talking to the sky. It felt like talking to a friend. Some mornings, he'd still ask for direction, but he didn't wait anxiously for a lightning bolt answer. He waited for peace. He waited for clarity to settle naturally, like sunlight creeping into a dark room. He realized that when you learn to listen, even ordinary moments become sacred. Sometimes, he'd be driving to work and suddenly feel the urge to call someone. Later, he'd find out that person really needed encouragement. Sometimes, he'd sense a gentle no when he was about to make a quick decision, and later thank God for it. It wasn't magic. It was relationship. And that's what makes this story powerful, because it's not about hearing voices or chasing signs. It's about awareness. The awareness that God is constantly speaking, through peace, through timing, through doors that open and close, through people he places in our path. The problem isn't that God's silent, it's that we rarely slow down long enough to notice his voice already echoing through our lives. Now, here's where the story meets you. Maybe you've been praying for direction, about your career, your family, your next move. Maybe it feels like heaven's on mute. But what if the answer isn't hiding? What if it's already there, woven into your everyday life, waiting for you to pause, breathe, and listen? Maybe it's in that unexpected peace you feel about one option over another. Maybe it's in that gentle hesitation before making a rushed decision. Maybe it's in the person who keeps showing up with the same encouragement you've been needing to hear. Maybe, just maybe, God's been answering you all along. And when you realize that, prayer stops being a duty. It becomes a rhythm. You start to see it everywhere, in quiet mornings, in commutes, in laughter, in tears. It's not about repeating perfect words anymore. It's about showing up honestly, like a child sitting with a parent. And in that space, something inside you shifts. You begin to recognize that the presence you thought was silent has actually been guiding you all along, patiently, gently, faithfully. So the man's 20-year wait wasn't wasted time. It was training, teaching him, and teaching us, that sometimes the greatest answers come, not in what we hear, but in how we learn to listen. So, what exactly changed for that man? He didn't suddenly start hearing a deep voice from the clouds. He didn't wake up with divine blueprints for his future. What changed was his posture, not his words, not his faith, but the way he approached the conversation. He learned that prayer isn't just talking to God. It's talking with him. That one shift, from to with, changes everything. Because when you talk to someone, you're broadcasting. You're sending words out, hoping they land somewhere. But when you talk with someone, you're building connection. You're open to what comes back. You're listening as much as you're speaking. And that's what most of us forget. We've been taught to pray, to say the right things, to follow a pattern, but no one really taught us how to listen. We grow up hearing, pray about it. But rarely do we hear, pause after you pray. It's like we've been performing monologues, thinking they're conversations. Imagine calling your best friend, pouring out your heart for 5 minutes straight, and then hanging up before they can say a single word. That's what many of us do with God, every single day. We say, "God, I need your help. God, fix this. God, show me what to do. Amen." And we're gone. We leave no space. No silence. No expectation of response. And then we wonder why we can't hear him. Here's the truth, God's not hard to reach. He's not hiding behind the clouds waiting for us to say the magic phrase. He's speaking all the time, in ways we often overlook. Through the peace that settles in your chest when something's right. Through the uneasiness that warns you when something's off. Through the verse that suddenly feels alive when you read it. Through the person who says the exact words you needed to hear. Through doors that close, not to punish you, but to protect you. But you can't notice any of that if your life is full of noise. We live in an age of distraction, phone buzzing, notifications flashing, thoughts racing. We pray for 5 minutes but scroll for 5 hours. And somewhere in between, we whisper, "God, why aren't you saying anything?" The truth? He is. We're just drowning his voice out with everything else. Here's a picture that might help. Think of God's voice like a radio signal, always broadcasting. If you're tuned to the wrong frequency, it's not that the station stopped playing. You just can't hear it clearly. To tune in, you've got to dial down the noise, the worry, the rush, the endless chatter in your own head. That's what the man learned after 20 years of waiting. He realized that sometimes, the key to hearing God isn't shouting louder, it's becoming quieter. He discovered that silence isn't empty, it's space where clarity can finally speak. And maybe that's what you need too. Not another list of what to say, but permission to stop saying for a moment. Because real prayer, the kind that changes you, happens when you start expecting God to speak back. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be a booming voice from heaven. It might just be peace in a moment where everything else feels chaotic. It might be that quiet conviction that you can't explain. It might even be the courage to let go of something you were never meant to carry. Let me tell you this, God's not a suggestion box. He's not waiting to collect requests and stamp approved or denied. He's a father, and fathers want dialogue. When your child talks to you, you don't want a script. You want honesty. You want them to share what's really going on, even if it's messy. Even if they don't have the right words. And you also want them to listen, because relationship isn't one-sided. That's what God wants too. He's not impressed by big words. He's moved by real hearts. So when you pray, don't perform, just pour. Pour out your fears. Pour out your gratitude. Pour out your confusion. And then pause, not in religious duty, but in expectation, because the one you're talking to actually responds. You see, we've been trained to think that prayer is about convincing God to act. But often, prayer is how God changes us, how he aligns our hearts, our priorities, our focus, until we start to see through his perspective. When you start praying with him, not just to him, you'll notice that your prayers become less about controlling outcomes and more about deepening connection. You'll find that you stop praying, "God, fix this," and start praying, "God, show me what you're doing here." You'll stop praying, "God, change them," and start praying, "God, change how I see them." That's when growth happens. That's when faith becomes personal. Think about how friendships work. The more time you spend together, the easier it becomes to recognize each other's voice, even in a crowded room. It's the same with God. The more time you spend in conversation with him, real conversation, the more familiar his voice becomes. You start noticing his nudges, his peace, his timing. And soon, you won't have to question every decision with fear. You'll move with quiet confidence because you've learned to trust his tone. So what does that look like in real life? It could mean sitting in silence for a few minutes after you pray, resisting the urge to rush off. It could mean journaling what comes to mind, then noticing over time how God weaves those thoughts together. It could mean being attentive, paying attention to recurring themes, verses, or words that seem to follow you around. You'll begin to realize that God's voice often sounds like peace, not pressure. It confirms, it doesn't confuse. It aligns with love, not fear. The more you tune in, the more you recognize the difference. Let's be honest, listening isn't easy. We're wired for action. We feel like we're wasting time when we're not talking, not moving, not doing. But the greatest clarity often comes in moments of stillness. Think about it, if you're in a loud room, even your closest friend would have to shout for you to hear them. But if you both step into a quiet space, even a whisper becomes powerful. That's what God does. He whispers, not because he wants to be distant, but because he wants us close enough to hear. So the next time you pray, imagine God leaning in, waiting, smiling, listening. And when you're done speaking, resist the urge to fill the silence. Just breathe. Sit there. Because somewhere in that quiet, he's speaking. You might feel awkward at first. You might start wondering if you're doing it wrong. Your mind will wander, that's okay. Don't fight it. Just gently bring yourself back. Listening to God isn't about perfection, it's about presence. Even 1 minute of genuine stillness with him can do more for your soul than hours of anxious talking. Here's something that helps many people: ask God questions, then listen for how he responds over time. Ask things like, God, what do you want me to learn from this season? Who do you want me to encourage today? What should I focus on right now? You might not hear an instant answer, but pay attention in the days that follow. Watch how certain thoughts, people, or opportunities begin to align around those questions. God has a way of weaving his answers into the rhythm of your life. That's how the man in our story began living. His prayers became lighter, less rehearsed, more relational. He stopped begging for direction and started listening for alignment. And you know what happened? He started walking with peace, not because every decision was easy, but because he knew he wasn't walking alone. When you learn to pray like that, when prayer becomes a dialogue, not a performance, life doesn't necessarily get easier, but it becomes clearer. You stop feeling lost even when you don't have all the answers. You start sensing that quiet confidence that says, even if I don't know the way, I know the one who does. That's what happens when you talk with God. Let's pause for a moment and think about this. Why does this story matter so much, not just for that man, but for you? Because maybe you've been in his shoes too. Still praying for that breakthrough. Still hoping for a clear sign. Still asking the same question, day after day, God, what do you want me to do? And maybe, like him, you've started to wonder if heaven's gone quiet. But what if, just like that man, God's been speaking all along, only not in the way you expected? See, most of us look for God in the loud moments, the miracles, the flashes of clarity, the unmistakable signs. But if we're honest, real life isn't usually like that. Most of the time, God moves quietly. He whispers. He nudges. He speaks through timing, through peace, through ordinary moments that don't feel spiritual at all. You don't always realize it while it's happening. It's only later, when you look back, that you see it, the gentle hand that guided you through every twist and turn. That's the mystery of walking with God. His voice doesn't compete with the noise. It waits for the stillness. Maybe the delay in your life isn't punishment. Maybe it's preparation. Maybe God isn't being silent, he's teaching you a new language, the language of patience, trust, and presence. Because sometimes, he doesn't give us the answers we want, because he's shaping us into the kind of person who can handle the answers when they come. The man in our story spent 20 years asking the same question. But when he finally learned to listen, he realized that the waiting had changed him. He'd grown gentler. Wiser. More grounded. The silence had become his teacher. And that's what God does, he transforms our waiting rooms into classrooms. When you finally slow down enough to listen, something beautiful happens. You begin to notice that God's guidance rarely comes in full instructions, it comes in steps. A thought that feels right. A door that opens at just the right time. A conversation that answers what you were thinking about the night before. It's not a spotlight showing the whole path, it's a lamp for your next step. That's how God leads, softly, steadily, faithfully. So if you're waiting for a thunderclap of clarity, maybe look instead for the small, consistent light that keeps showing up right where you are. There's something sacred about quiet. It's where truth settles in after all the noise dies down. It's where your heart starts to catch up with your words. It's where God meets you, not in the rush of performance, but in the calm of presence. Think about it. The most powerful moments in life are rarely loud. Births. Deaths. Forgiveness. Love. Peace. All of them happen in quiet rooms, in gentle spaces, in whispers. That's where God lives too, in the stillness between your words, in the pause after your prayers. Maybe you're listening now, and deep down, you realize you've been trying too hard to hear something dramatic. You've been waiting for a lightning bolt when what you really need is a lamp. Let me tell you, God doesn't need to shout to get your attention. He's already sitting beside you, speaking through the peace that refuses to leave your heart. If you've been praying about a big decision, maybe your next step, a relationship, a dream, and it feels like you're not getting a clear answer, don't panic. Ask yourself this: what brings peace, not pressure? What draws me closer to love, not fear? That's usually where his voice lives. Because God's voice never manipulates. It never confuses. It never pushes you toward fear or anxiety. It comforts, aligns, and gently leads. So what happened to the man? Well, he didn't wake up one day with a divine to-do list. But he did begin to live differently. He stopped chasing answers and started walking with awareness. He found beauty in small things, a quiet morning, laughter around the dinner table, the peace that came from knowing he wasn't walking alone. He once said to a friend, "For 20 years, I thought God was silent. Turns out, he was speaking the whole time. I just hadn't learned his volume." Because God doesn't need to change his volume, we need to change our attention. When you learn to pause, breathe, and listen, you start realizing the truth. God's never stopped talking. You just needed to make space to hear him. Your turn to listen. So maybe tonight, when the noise dies down, after the scrolling, after the talking, after the rushing, just sit for a moment. No script. No checklist. No perfect words. Just sit. And say, "God, I'm here. I'm listening." Then wait. You might not hear a dramatic answer, but watch what happens in your heart. Watch how peace slowly replaces panic. Watch how direction starts to make sense, not all at once, but little by little. Because when you finally stop talking, you realize he's been speaking all along. The man's story doesn't end with a miracle, it ends with maturity. And that's even better. He learned that God's greatest answers are often disguised as ordinary days. That silence doesn't mean absence. That faith isn't about control, it's about trust. And as he sat by that same window years later, coffee in hand, sunrise spilling across the sky, he smiled. He no longer prayed, "God, show me what to do." He whispered instead, "God, thank you for walking with me." And in that whisper, he finally realized something profound. The peace he'd been searching for wasn't somewhere out there, it had been within him the whole time. Because when you walk with God, you're never really waiting, you're just learning to listen. So if this story resonated with you, remember this. God's silence isn't rejection. It's invitation. An invitation to pause, breathe, and listen. Because maybe the answer you've been waiting for has already been whispered. All you need to do now is be still enough to hear it.